So, let me ask you a rather obnoxious question. What is the scariest action movie? And before you answer, I don't mean action horror, as in it's a horror movie with action-packed presentation, or is very explicitly a hybrid genre piece like Predator, From Dusk Till Dawn, or Overlord. I'm talking about a film that goes in with the intention of being pure, unadulterated action cinema that just so happens, whether indirectly or not, to evoke feelings we might traditionally associate with horror, like fear, anxiety, sadness, and disgust. Of course, there's no doubt it's a contrived question that ultimately highlights how pedantic and futile genre is as a way to categorize a film or story. In fact, if I'm being honest, this is just all a pretentious effort to find a unique angle in which to frame this review, so bollocks it, let's talk about Assault on Precinct 13. John Carpenter's 1976 action cult classic Assault on Precinct 13 tells the story of exactly what it says on the tin. During his first day on the job, Police Lieutenant Ethan Bishop is assigned with overseeing the closure of a south-central Los Angeles precinct when, luck would have it, a violent gang known as Street Thunder decide to besiege the building and murder all of its remaining occupants. What ensues is a very simple battle for survival, as Bishop develops an unlikely alliance with a charming, albeit dubiously enigmatic death row inmate called Napoleon Wilson, as they try to defend the precinct until help hopefully arrives. Like I said in my Dread review, which you should go watch if you haven't already, it's a rather rustic and haphazard film that cares little for conventional storytelling or exposition, and instead leaves the chaos entirely up to the viewer to work out for themselves, through small nuggets of information that build up a world that's left to live and breathe for itself. By design, it's a messy and modestly grounded take on random acts of violence and moral panic, as the gang is fueled by pure vengeance against the police establishment for ambushing and gunning down several of their members during a botched arms robbery. It brutally cements the gang's worldview in its opening moments by framing the police as faceless, gun-toting aggressors in the eyes of the gang, with the shadows over the deceased evoking prison bars. Obviously, it's not to say the gang are justified in their motives, but it's details like this that highlight the tremendous strength in Carpenter's minimalistic direction and storytelling ability, as he manages to achieve a fair bit of world building out of his $100,000 budget. Now, just to set some reasonable expectations, Assault on Precinct 13 is certainly no masterpiece, and like several of Carpenter's other films, was received poorly both critically and commercially in its time. However, it's since been re-evaluated as a relatively important film in the development of action cinema prior to the testosterone-fueled boom of the 80s. One could even argue it actually paved the way for many of Carpenter's later films, including Halloween, The Fog, Escape from New York, They Live, and even Big Trouble in Little China, because while genre conventions might dictate Assault on Precinct 13 to action cinema, and rightfully so, perhaps the most unique aspect of it working with such a limited budget is the fact it indirectly frames itself as a bit of a horror film. Now, before we blow open the door of justice, this video is sponsored by Vezi. No matter the weather, we should all be able to say yes to adventure, and Vezi's goal is to empower you to step into every opportunity without hesitation, from road trips and hikes to simply running errands around town or walking your dog. With Vezi's Stormburst, you are prepared for every possibility, whether it be wet sidewalks, muddy trails, sleet, snow, ice, or steep, uneven terrain. I actually wear Vezi Stormburst quite often when walking Cheddar because, as you can imagine, he's incredibly spontaneous and thus isn't one to stick to the beaten path, instead choosing to excitably venture us up slippy forest hills and through deceptively deep puddles. However, like all of Vezi's footwear range, Stormburst are 100% waterproof and designed with lightweight breathable Dymatex material, which allows for a compact and sturdy shoe without the overbearing weight and rigidness of your average walking boot. Stormburst have unbelievable grip to provide better traction acceleration and safety on slippery surfaces, which for someone as boring and risk-averse as me when it comes to walking, goes that extra bit further to encouraging me to take surprising and curious detours. Take the first step toward adventure with Vezi by visiting vezi.com/ryanhollinger to keep your outdoor adventure comfortable and dry, explore confidently, and enjoy 15% off your first pair at checkout. Now, just a quick note, I will briefly talk about the admirably decent 2005 remake at the end and how it broadly differs, but to properly gauge what makes the original so unique, we obviously have to explore the pseudo-horror behind Precinct 13. It's also sort of worth acknowledging, not to downplay my own video, that I'm not saying anything particularly new with this key observation. Everyone and their mother has already pointed out how the gang is so overtly presented as borderline supernatural, even evoking a malevolent rawness Carpenter would later use in his own horror films. In fact, it's become so common that retrospectively, Carpenter himself has even acknowledged this interpretation in multiple sources, including later DVD commentaries, mainly due to how much the imagery seems to resemble George A. Romero's seminal Night of the Living Dead, which conceptually also happened to be a haphazard siege film dealing with an onslaught of mindless killers. Hell, I know it came out 2 years later and was certainly unintentional, but I even felt the opening of Romero's Dawn of the Dead evokes similar qualities to Precinct 13, with all the chaos, violence, and hysteria that echoes social themes spread across both films. I will say, however, that while Romero was known to press social commentary into his later works, Carpenter has always been pretty loose about his socially conscious intentions when making films. More so, without getting deep into the nitty-gritty of it all, one could argue Carpenter wrote Precinct 13 from the perspective of how he simply saw the world in that moment, with the opening making some acknowledgement to police perpetuating cycles of unrest, with how the ambush is visually insinuated to be perhaps a prejudicial killing in response to the out-of-control chaos the gang war has plunged LA into. The thing is, the film is very vague and ambiguous with what state this version of the world is in. What we see of South Central LA looks more like an apocalyptic Wild West, and the film even directly calls attention to it when it's later explained that the entire area around the precinct has been condemned and abandoned, thus we are technically in a ghost town for the most part. When we first meet the gang leaders following what they perceive as a massacre by the police, they perform a literal blood ritual that's presented in an inherently sinister fashion, especially due to the ominous score composed by Carpenter himself. Nothing about what we've seen so far clearly screams action movie, but it sets the tone for how the eventual conflict is elevated above your average shooty bang bang. In contrast to what we've seen so far, when we're introduced to Bishop, he comes from an affluent neighbourhood which he later explains to one of the precinct secretaries, Lee, came after he was able to break free from his upbringing in a gang-infested area and make something of himself. What seems to have drawn him to law enforcement was when his strict father scorned him for his bad behaviour as a kid, with one anecdote explaining how his father actually sent him to Precinct 13 to be scared by the police for swearing at his mother. Thematically, it does tie into this perception of law and order by building an empathetic picture of the characters in the world they live in, with Bishop feeling indebted to the police for shaping his own upbringing. In fact, a line that stuck out to me was when Bishop initially sulks at the idea of babysitting a defunct precinct when his commander tells him there are no heroes, only those who follow orders, tapping into this underlying apathy and sentiment of defeat that the police feel towards the rampant disorder that's gone completely out of control. I won't spoil anything just yet, but it foreshadows this dwindling zealousness Bishop begins to lose as the siege worsens, eventually echoing and consolidating a world without heroes in the deliberately deflating tone of the film's conclusion. In a general sense, because we never see the rest of LA, most likely due to its limited budget, it does seem to constantly allude to abnormal levels of crime, or maybe I'm just being incredibly fucking ignorant of how bad LA actually is. Yet, after Napoleon Wilson is introduced in what I like to describe as John Carpenter's early draft for Snake Plissken, I then started to theorize if Precinct 13 itself was a drafted prologue for Escape from New York. Because the thing is, That film focuses on a similar dystopian future where crime has reached such unimaginably devastating levels to the point New York itself is literally converted into a prison. If you go into the film with that in mind, you can see where I got the loose apocalyptic vibes from with its limited depiction of LA. Anyway, when it comes to Napoleon Wilson, he is a pure enigma. He's polite, slick, and charming as he constantly seeks a cigarette, but there is a massive asterisk against him where he's being transferred to death row for reasons that remain completely unknown. It's largely assumed he killed people, but it's made out that not knowing is probably for the best because it might destroy whatever sympathy we have of him. My assumption was that he maybe killed a bunch of gang members and it's a point about justice swinging in contradictory ways, but he could also be like a family annihilator or Ted Bundy for all we know. Hell, Napoleon Wilson isn't even his name apparently. The most he gives us is a vague, cryptic story about when he was a kid and a priest told him there was something off about him, that he carried a presence of death, but at the same time there's a smirk on Wilson's face that could also suggest he's deliberately being obtuse. His story begins when he's being transferred to another prison along with several other inmates, only to eventually end up at the precinct after one inmate falls violently ill in the wrong place at the wrong time. The gang meanwhile commence their blood pact of retaliation against the police and by extension the innocent as a vengeful message to evoke further fear. It starts with the gang targeting random citizens to fulfill a bloodlust, leading to the film's most infamous scene, when they coldly gun down a child in broad daylight, prompting her father to chase down the gang and kill one of the leaders before they chase him to the precinct where the siege commences. It's definitely an understatement to say it is jarringly visceral how willing the film is to show a child get blasted so casually on screen, which not only cements the nightmarish overtone, but is elevated further by tragedy when earlier in the film, her anxious father explains they're only in the area to collect his mother and get her out of there due to the increasing gang warfare. Like Bishop and the transfer bus, everyone is just in the wrong place at the very wrong time. From here, the film only continues to hit us with abrupt crescendos, when the father ends up spending the rest of the movie passed out from shock, while the power is cut to the area and several established characters are unceremoniously gunned down from a distance. This is where the film truly sparked the Living Dead comparisons, because the gang just emerge from the darkness like forces of nature and mindlessly attack without any care for self-preservation. They begin by relentlessly shooting the building with silenced weapons, which, yeah, I know silencers make noise in real life, but the characters distinctly note being unable to hear the bullets, as though there's something otherworldly about the ordeal. It creates confusion and shock, and visually it looks like they're under siege by a poltergeist rather than a barrage of bullets, reinforced by the eerily quiet atmosphere, and when the shooting finally stops, the gang are just suddenly gone, furthering the bewilderment of the characters. However, after the survivors get their bearings, the horde of mindless killers return, but distinctly there is no ambient noise to accompany them, no footsteps, breathing, or chatter. It makes the piercing smash of a jar of blood hit like a jump scare, with Bishop noting the gang have marked the precinct with a cryptic message, which is further explained by an inmate called Wells as signaling a tribalistic attack where the gang do not fear death and will kill at all costs. The second wave attack that ensues sees the gang literally throw themselves at the precinct, as Bishop has the inmates freed to help them stem the onslaught, with Wilson being given perhaps the greatest shotgun in cinema. Now, curiously, the movie doesn't stop to question morality or trust amongst the inmates and other survivors. There's a common unspoken acceptance of putting their differences aside to take down a common enemy that's an irreconcilable threat to everyone. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, so to speak. Regardless of the different lives they live, contrary to the threat they're up against, they share a singular interest: Survival. Once the attack subsides, Wilson highlights how the gang are covering their tracks with an alarming swiftness, by taking the bodies and even the transfer bus without anyone noticing. It further compounds this otherworldliness as the survivors are baffled at the gang's behaviour, with Wilson even sarcastically commenting on how it's as if they're all in a dream, a nightmare even. With limited options, Wells is chosen to sneak out of the precinct, hotwire a car and call for help, but calling back to the unspoken unity between the survivors and the inmates, Wilson reminds Wells of the latter task, knowing full well that once Wells is out, well, he's out. It's here where the film solidifies its inherent sense of nihilism, when Wells does manage to hotwire a car, but ends up hesitating to go to the phone, only to be killed by a gang member hiding in the back seat, immediately cutting the dramatic music and sucking all the energy out of the room. There's a degree to which the gang are almost toying with them and relishing in the terror, soon commencing a third attack as the survivors bury themselves in the basement, ready to make one last stand. During all of this, two disgruntled officers doing the rounds soon come across evidence of the carnage and call for backup, despite all departments being under-resourced and overloaded with other crime around the city. It conveys a nail-biting tension as you desperately hope they make it in time before the gang kills everyone, as they set the precinct ablaze and bombard themselves at the survivors at all angles, while Bishop makes one last critical attempt to shoot a propane tank to clear the hallway, and thankfully succeeds by the skin of his teeth. The film ends with what I guess I would describe as an appropriately unsatisfying abruptness. Echoing Bishop's commander, there are no heroes left in this world, only those who follow orders. What's left is nothing but meaningless deaths surrounding the characters. Nothing is gained, instead only lost. The rest of the gang then flees with no consequence, and we're left simply to accept that they're most likely destined to do this all again. It's a bang followed by a whimper. Mirroring the opening ambush and the police's resigned disposition on the state of crime, there's a feeling of anger and apathy towards the devastation, less so relief, except when Bishop has Wilson leave with him, if indeed Wilson's own future is left uncertain. I mean, it doesn't absolve him of his death sentence, but for Bishop personally, he wants to let bygones be bygones. Who you are as a person doesn't matter when survival is the cost, because if you don't put your differences aside and work together, then nobody serves to gain anything out of the carnage. Now, to end, let's briefly talk about the 2005 remake, which I honestly think is a very good, suspenseful mid-2000s action thriller that you can't go wrong with if you want to scratch that die-hard itch. In fact, it pairs quite nicely with another siege thriller called Hostage, coincidentally starring Bruce Willis, that released about 6 weeks apart. However, for as much as I recommend it, I've actually seen it a number of times, believe it or not, to its credit, and perhaps so its own detriment, if you're a purist for the original, it's basically its own thing. There's no superstitious or supernatural-esque atmosphere or mindless gang seeking to commit pure havoc. It's actually the complete inverse in both plot and structure, where the precinct is attacked by coordinated mercenaries and crooked cops trying to specifically kill this film's own version of Napoleon Wilson, who is replaced with a crime lord being targeted for assassination so he doesn't testify against the cops working for him. There's definitely more meat on the bone in terms of general story, but ultimately it's still the same shooty bang bang at heart. Controversially, I actually think a lot of people will prefer this more over the original because there are a few twists and turns, and it develops a number of interesting characters, even giving some of them much more to do. I won't spoil too much, but in particular, this film's version of Wells' escape is significantly grimmer because it involves characters who you'd archetypically expect to be more relevant to the plot. I also love the switch to a snowstorm to mask the gunshots and intensify the isolation given its New Year's. It's a clever way to grind it since it's omitting the supernatural superstitious angle, yet overall it's a pretty good watch, even if it lacks the rustic mystique of Carpenter's film. Nonetheless, you can't go wrong with Ethan Hawke and Lawrence Fishburne, so fuck it, have at it.